All right, so we're ready to go.
Evelyn, we'll give it a minute or two here and then get started.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll shoot at 12:01. Although I believe people technically can't see us right now.
Okay.
Evelyn, we'll start here in 30 seconds.
Okay.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar hosted by the Midwest Pediatric Device Consortium, or MPDC. My name is Dwayne Mancini. I'm the CEO at Project Medtech. It's my distinct honor to be moderating the webinar series on behalf of the MPDC. For those of us joining us live on YouTube, we encourage you to actively participate by submitting your questions in the chat at any time. I'll be monitoring it throughout the entire session here. So as you have questions, as Evelyn discusses different topics, real time, drop in the questions, and I'll pipe them into Evelyn. This is intended to be an interactive webinar, and we'll be monitoring those the comments and questions. Today marks our third episode of our webinar series here with MPDC. Over the coming months, we'll be presenting a range of topics crucial to the advancements of pediatric medical devices. The dates of our future webinars can be found on the MPDC website, which is pedsinnovation.org, but they'll be July 8th, August 20th, and September 17th. Furthermore, we're pleased to announce an in-person showcase scheduled for July 9th in Cleveland, Ohio. We'd love to see anyone who's passionate about pediatric device development join us for this opportunity, connect and collaborate in person. The Midwest Pediatric Device Consortium is an FDA-funded initiative focused on advancing device development across the country, guided by the expertise and dedication of professionals from leading pediatric medical institutions in the region, Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, The Ohio State University in Columbus, Cincinnati Children's in Cincinnati, Ohio, and Cleveland Clinic Children's in Cleveland, Ohio. Their leadership is instrumental in the MPDC's mission to foster innovation and facilitate the development of much-needed medical devices for our youngest patients. As a valued service, the MPDC facilitates informal discussions with the Chief of Pediatrics at the FDA. This provides a unique and direct avenue to discuss regulatory strategies and the specific considerations pertinent to pediatric medical device applications. For those of you actively engaged in pediatric medical device innovation and seeking guidance on regulatory pathways or commercialization strategies, we encourage you to connect with the MPDC through their website. They're also available to discuss your concepts and explore potential pathways forward. To stay informed about future webinars, we invite you to subscribe to the MPDC's YouTube channel, which can be found by searching at Peds Innovation and also following their LinkedIn page. Today, our focus is on a crucial and often challenging aspect of bringing new technology to market, whether it be pediatric or medical devices, health economics, but as this pertains specifically to pediatric medical technology. Proving a device is safe and effective is only one part of the journey. Demonstrating its economic value and understanding the factors that influence cost effectiveness are paramount for a device to be adopted and reach the children who need it. To help us navigate this complex landscape, we are honored to host an expert in this field, Evelyn Rizzo. She brings a wealth of experience and deep understanding of the unique economic considerations and hurdles involved in the pediatric medtech space. Evelyn and I have some great preliminary discussions, and today we aim to explore the core components of a successful health economic strategy. We'll discuss how to define value from the perspective of different stakeholders, how to build a compelling case for cost effectiveness, and how to approach the economic questions that are critical for device adoption and reimbursement. It's now my pleasure to formally introduce our guest today for our discussion, Evelyn Rizzo. Evelyn, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Dwayne.
Yeah. So, Evelyn, I think, to start, maybe an introduction to who you are, what you do, and your background would be great.
Absolutely. Thank you. My clinical background is in rehabilitation science. I worked for over a decade providing mobility devices to children and adults that had, issues with mobility from or disability and physical disabilities that cause birth injuries. So I have a lot of experience with medical devices in that space and some of the reimbursement challenges we would face as children grew and they needed replacements of those devices. We would have to justify, that expense to the payers. So that difficulty in reimbursement led me to get a master's degree in health economics because, from a clinical perspective, we didn't spend that much time thinking about the economic benefit. We were focused only on, clinical benefits to the patients that we saw directly every day. But what the payers are looking at are, usually a huge swath of the population, and they're very concerned about the economic story that is their bottom line. So with the health economics degree, I've been able to hone that story both with medical technologies and pharmaceuticals, and I have a better understanding of how we can take fantastic technology and get that to the patients with, better evidence development.
Awesome. Yeah, it brings up another question, actually. So you do your master's in health economics. How much continuing education does that take, right? Because I would equate this, I guess, to my background, where it's like, oh, okay, if you become a regulatory expert, it's always constantly evolving and changing, and there's new guidance documents and new this. I mean, I'm guessing that's pretty much the same on the health economic side.
Yeah, so our major organization is ISPOR, and we meet twice a year, once in North America and once in Europe. And we come together as, I belong to the medical device special interest group, and the digital technology. So what we do is we come up with how are those devices currently being covered, what evidence is currently being used to support those devices, and how do we measure those outcomes. So, we get really nuanced in how those outcomes are being measured because different payers and different countries have different methods for reimbursement. So we want to make sure that people are measuring the outcomes in a similar fashion and in the most efficient fashion to get those, just those outcomes make sense across different geographical areas and different payers.
Yeah, Evelyn, how do you manage that? Like for regulatory approval, you got to, if you're in the US, you got to go through the FDA. In your scenario, though, there's multiple payers, there's CMS. I mean, can you kind of give us the lay of the land there as well? Because I think that might be confusing to some who don't know that space.
Sure. For the most part, for a long time, a randomized control trial was pretty much needed to get your device covered. But these days, there's a lot more interest in real world evidence. And in some cases with rare disease and even with pediatrics, because there are smaller populations being treated, we can get reimbursement on a kind of a lesser rigor of evidence. So like case studies, situations where it's not possible to do a randomized control trial when there's such a small population that are being studied.
Yes, super helpful. And actually, I will plug, you can go back and watch any of the previous webinars we've done. The first one we did was navigating pediatric regulatory pathways. That's a good watch, but you just brought up real world evidence. That was exactly what we talked about last time, was how do you generate clinical evidence in a space like peds that may be difficult. So again, go to the YouTube channel. You can watch these old episodes. There's a ton of knowledge in all of them, and not because of me, but because of the guests. And so it's a good one to watch. All right, Evelyn, can you give the audience a little bit of an overview of what makes the pediatric space so uniquely challenging from your perspective as it pertains to health economics?
Sure. Sometimes with pediatrics, we have to look at what we call novel value drivers. So it's not necessarily just the clinical outcomes, but there's other complexities that need to be taken into consideration to truly show the value of the device, like caregiver burden. If parents have to take time off work, 3 times a month or 10 times a month, that can really, impact their work performance, their ability to earn. So these are things specifically with pediatric populations that can be used as what we call the novel value drivers. So, and as I mentioned earlier, clinical recruitment can be tough because there might not be as many people available within this particular age range. Some of the outcome measures that are used in adults don't always transfer to pediatrics. So there are some, validated outcomes measures that are designed specifically for children, but then they might not be applicable to that particular disease state. So that adds an extra cost if you're entering a therapeutic area with a pediatric device. You want those patient reported outcomes to enhance your value story, but you might have to create and validate a measure which can add a lot of time to your work. Plus, children grow, so these you might have to replace the device multiple times, whereas with an adult you don't. So that can be very expensive, and it can be hard to demonstrate immediate savings for payers.
Yeah, it's super interesting because we talked about that for the regulatory side of things as well. Just with patients growing and maybe needing new devices because you outgrow it. I think we specifically use neuromodulation space or something like that. But yeah, really interesting. Okay, so when we talk about health economics for pediatric devices, it's far more than just the price of the device. Why is demonstrating economic value in pediatrics so different and often more complex than for adult technologies?
Well, the first thing I think about is the time horizon. So, what we do to help children now, those savings might not be recognized until later on, a lot later on, in fact. Like as an adult, they might be able to, walk without a mobility device, or, reach a level of independence that they might not have if they had not received treatment as children, which means that the payers that pay for those devices don't see the value. So, of course, it creates, a little bit of a conflict between who's paying and who's actually benefiting in the cost savings. So that does create, a bit of a complication. So, a lot of times these devices, adult devices, are being used for pediatrics. They're either being modified, so it's hard to find examples of similar devices being used within the healthcare system. So, just to kind of help boost up the value of these types of interventions. So, definitely you have a smaller sample size too. So these all create a more difficult health economics, situation.
Yeah. Yeah. The time or the sample size one is just, it's really interesting, right? Because, when we talk to device companies that have adult devices, right? We always talk about how important it is to collect clinical data, and there's really not a good reason why you're not collecting clinical data. But in the Pete's case, it's quite literally like you just might be a little bit more hamstrung on how you're going to collect this data. I want to circle back to the first point though, of like, how is that handled today when a payer who pays now for something might not get the benefit of it later on?
Well, private payers generally follow Medicare, Medicaid guidelines, and a lot of children are actually covered by Medicaid. So Medicaid will cover, my clinical experience is in rehabilitation. So, they would cover, say, an AFO, which is ankle foot orthosis, once a year. And, that was considered the standard of care based on the children's growth. So private payers then in turn would also cover at the same level, even if they don't necessarily see future reimbursement. They still generally cover at the same level as Medicare, Medicaid. So it's just because it's the standard of care. That would be, but when it comes to new technologies, new, more expensive technologies, that's when the burden of evidence has to be built, and hopefully find some back to those novel value drivers that would encourage a payer to cover it. If it's employer-sponsored plan and their employee has to, is missing 10, 20 hours of work a month to take care of their child, or they could provide this device and their child can go to school, then you have a value story for that employer-covered plan. And now there are a lot more employer-covered plans out there. So that's when you build those cases for those value drivers specifically designed for the payer in mind.
Awesome. Super helpful. Okay. So value can mean different things to different people. How should an innovator think about defining the value proposition for the different stakeholders, right? For example, like obviously insurance and payers, the clinician, and hospital administration.
Well, it's important to decide where your product's going to be used, because in some cases, not all those people are going to pay for your device. It might just be used in a hospital setting. It might just be used in a home setting. So depending on what your device is and who your patient body is and where the point of care is, then once that decision is made, then you can decide what is the value for that particular stakeholder. It saves you some time. So, a hospital administrator is going to focus on upfront costs. Like, is it going to save us more time if we introduce this new technology? Do we have to have, less nurses available for this technology? That could be a substantial cost savings that you could demonstrate to a hospital administrator, and they're very interested in that. Some hospitals, they won't incur any new costs. So if you have a technology, even if it's the best technology in the universe, and your chart, it's going to cost them an extra couple $1,000 a month, and you're not replacing time or any other cost items, you might not have a case at all. So it's important to think about what you're replacing and what value you're creating for the hospital. If you're selling directly to clinicians, something that they would use in their office, functional outcomes might be something that they're more interested in, or even less patient visits. So if I provide a patient with something in my office and they only have to come once a year versus 5 times a year, depending on the level of reimbursement. And if I have higher dollar patients coming in, that might be an excellent value story for me, because I would rather see high ticket patients than, a $80, adjustment visit. So that could be a really strong value story.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Keep going, Evelyn. Yeah, keep going.
Okay. From the payer angle, it comes down to value, but also like what evidence is currently available. They update their coverage determinations on an annual basis based on like a literature review. So if the evidence isn't strong enough, they're not going to cover a novel device, even if one study said it was great. It has to have a substantial body of evidence available. They look at cost per quality, which, there's people on the fence about whether quality should be used or not, especially when it comes to people with disabilities. It is not necessarily a good measure, but we haven't found a better, more widely used method of determining patient outcomes. So, and again, pediatric benchmarks are lacking there. So that's all different.
Yeah, no, that's helpful, Evelyn. Yeah, I think, circling back to the hospital side of things, I think that's the one where that's one of those ones that I had my perspective on that really opened up when, Sean McGibbon on the Project Medtech team and Jamie Easterling, just listening to those two who both ran hospital systems, listening to them talk about how they evaluated technology or how they would look at new technology. It's really, really interesting. It's things that I guess I just never thought of what's preferred. And, healthcare is there's a lot to the business side of it. And so understanding this is really important. So this kind of brings us to a critical challenge. Short-term ROI, payers and hospitals often focus on near-term budgets. How can a device with significant long-term benefits for a child, like preventing future surgeries or improving quality of life, make a compelling short-term economic case, right? I think the long-term case you've kind of talked about here, right? I mean, hey, if this device is gonna, reduce this child from having 4 more open heart surgeries down to 1, that's pretty clear. What about that short-term economic case?
Well, in some cases, the hospital isn't going to pay for those devices. If there is it depends. It depends if the device is included in, these bundled payments of that Medicare and Medicaid use, which are referred to as DRG payments. If it is included in that, then if the extra cost, it just might not happen for the patient, unfortunately. But if there is a mechanism for which they could charge for it separately, or if there might be more momentum from the for the hospital to provide this device. One thing is time and motion studies are available and a resource to small medtech companies. Check. I mean, if you think your device is going to save time, that is always of interest to hospitals. And people have published many time and motion studies. So this is something that you could reference as, as a baseline for how much time are they currently spending doing X. Then you can say, do I think my device is going to save time? But a lot of those studies are already published. That is a time point, a economic point that they're interested in. Reduced hospital stays or length of stay is definitely something of interest. Hopefully you can show something to support that your device would shorten the length of stay. Like maybe the surgical complications are less, because if the hospital is, again, we're not negating the long-term benefits of this procedure, but we're just looking to see if there are any short-term benefits to the hospital. So you could also create, from the payer's perspective, show that you're preventing things further down the road. like cost avoidance structures. There are risk sharing agreements that are in place for certain innovations right now, where hospitals or payers will only pay if the certain outcomes predetermined or pre-agreed on are met. So those are just some of the ways that you could, enhance the value and the return of investment for the hospital.
Awesome. We did have a comment, just for those who maybe are not looking in the comments section. Travis Clark said, for those interested in value impact on a child's family, the FPB School of Nursing, which is the nursing school at Case Western Reserve University here in beautiful Cleveland, Ohio, has intensely studied parent stress and impact while caring for children who are technology dependent. So that was just a piece from Travis, just in the notes there. Says, Travis, thanks for sharing. So Evelyn, for the innovators and entrepreneurs in our audience, you've developed a checklist. And I think you put it on your website. So we're going to drop in the comments section the link to your website. I think you did it as a blog post. So there'll be the checklist that Evelyn is about to go over if you want to go look at it, download it, that kind of thing. But what are the essential components or data points they need to consider from day one to build a robust health economics model for their pediatric device? And the link is in the show notes, or the link is in the comment section now. But go ahead, Evelyn.
Sure. What gets me excited is evidence strategy and just finding the level of evidence that new technology will need to enter the market. So, the number one is to demonstrate unmet need. You may have the best device ever that addresses a problem, but you're the only one that thinks there's a problem. So sometimes publications or posters can help you and your product reach the market so that patients can actually access it by clearly defining the problem. I've seen it where people have a great idea, but it just the problem isn't as big as maybe they thought it was. So clearly define the clinical problem and why it's a problem. Is it a problem for caregivers, clinicians, payers? Who is suffering? And then you can even connect with special interest groups to just really pressure test your idea. Like, is this a problem? So once you know for certain that you have a problem, that then you can map your stakeholders. Is it the hospital that's going to pay? Is it the payer? Who's going to pay? Is it going to be an out-of-pocket cost? Those are the things that'd be the next step. And then, you got to articulate how your device will improve the outcomes. If you have a competitor device, what outcomes did they collect in their research? And then model your clinical studies after those outcomes. Because if you collect 5, totally different outcomes, any payer is going to look at it and be like, well, you said this is great, but the competitor says that's great. So, you really want to align and make sure that you're demonstrating better outcomes. So it's important to understand what research is already available for competitor products so that you can align your outcomes collection. Because if you collect the wrong outcomes, it could be very expensive to redo a study, and ultimately you wouldn't get reimbursement. So that is super important to align your outcomes you're collecting so that your evidence makes sense. Just choosing that competitor wisely. So I don't want to go through the whole list unless you have particular questions, Dwayne, but it is available for you to review. But just initially, when you first have those, that device that you're excited about, that's where you start. That's the important work to do, just from an economics standpoint. So.
Yeah. Evelyn, I'll make a statement and you tell me if you think it's off base, accurate, or you can expand on it. when we see a lot of companies, talk about their problem, right? They often cite their TAM SAM SOM, right? They talk about the cost to the healthcare system. It feels like maybe with pediatrics, you need to tell like more of a complete story. Like the problem might not just be, hey, heart disease is the second leading killer of people, right? Or whatever it is, right? I'm just making up a stat. It feels like with the pediatric population, you may need to say, hey, with this disease state, if we don't use this product, or we don't have our device, then they're going to end up costing the healthcare system X amount of money because of all these other problems. I mean, is that kind of what you're getting at with just kind of more articulating the clinical issue here?
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about, continuous glucose monitoring, that's something that I have a lot of experience working in the diabetes space. It took a long time for continuous glucose monitoring to be paid for by all payers. And, part of the value story, especially for children, is that they're not very good at maintaining their sugar levels. So, of course, parents have to worry constantly. These kids are going to school, friends give them something to eat, they're not taking insulin. There's if they have type 1 diabetes, they could have an emergency, or have hypoglycemic events, which can cause parents to lose work. They can cause additional hospital expenses. So now it is a standard of care. So you can just look back in the last 10 years and see what evidence had to be developed so that, I know that, certain payers, anyone with type 1 diabetes can now receive a continuous glucose monitor because there's enough evidence. But it wasn't just, one outcome. It took a lot of different outcomes from a lot of different, the parents, the children, schools even, the schools bear the burden of if your child is in their classroom and they, are having a diabetic complication because their glucose is out of whack. So this evidence built upon this becoming the standard of care. So you're absolutely right, Dwayne. It is different when it comes. You have to get all the people together to really build that value story. It can be very compelling when you have a lot of different people experiencing around the patient, how it impacts them too.
Yeah, awesome. We had one question come in in the comments section from Dory Jones. Fantastic content here. Kudos to you, Evelyn. Question: do you recommend any specific resources for time and motion studies?
Well, PubMed would be my go-to. You can type in time and motion, and you should be able to get a list of time and motion studies, and then add the therapeutic area that you're looking at. It's also possible to do your own time and motion study. If you're in the Cleveland area, we have a lot of hospitals around us. So, it is possible to set that one up if you cannot find a good resource. But yeah, PubMed would be my number one source for looking for a time and motion study. Other resources require, Embase requires that, maybe there's a paywall, but some of these articles you do have to pay. But I would go to PubMed, type in time and motion, type in your disease state or whatever. Maybe it's which one? Let me think what I was looking at the other day. Just checking vitals. So we were looking at a device that helps check patients' vitals when a nurse or assistant is not in the room. There is a time and motion study available that shows how much time a nursing staff spend every single day checking vitals. So that study has already been done, and you can find it online.
Super cool. Yeah, thanks, Evelyn. And I might just add too, I don't know, Dory, if you've played around with Gemini deep research, but even that might even pull up some things. If you gave it the right prompt, it might pull up some relevant research as well. Evelyn, one more comment from Naomi Gibson. She also agreed that you're giving great content, so kudos again. She tried the link and it was invalid, but there's a new comment that literally just came through that I think we may have fixed that. So if we didn't fix it for whatever reason, when we are done, Evelyn can check the link. And Evelyn, if you just come back onto this video after it's done and put it in the comments section, anybody could see it afterwards. So, and Naomi said it works, so we're all good. Okay. Okay, Evelyn. Okay, what kind of data is most convincing to payers and value assessment committees? How can innovators effectively leverage, you talked about it earlier, real-world evidence or data from registries to support their cost-effectiveness claims, especially when a large, long-term economic trial just probably isn't feasible?
Well, unfortunately, for a lot of startups, some of this data is very expensive. So while real world data is definitely a cheaper option than a randomized control trial, it can create, financial burden. But what it would take is, there's a lot of different data resources. So what you would come to them and you would ask them, how many people do you have with, how many pediatrics do you have in your data source with this particular condition? And they should be able to do a data poll and give you the number of patients that they have with this condition within a certain time range, and then tell you how much that would be. And then you could, based on that, they have, a lot of places have services where they can crunch the numbers for you if you're not, a data wizard yourself, or you could, pay for the slice of data, and if you have your own data analyst available to you. So that is a great way to do retrospective and observational research for your particular patient population. And that can really build on the actual evidence. Because what happens in randomized controlled trials is that you're not necessarily getting the sickest population, and those people that are selected for those trials are hand selected based on a really small inclusion criteria. So that's why real world evidence can be even more compelling when it comes to the value of your product, because it shows normal people under normal life experiences coming to a hospital. Do they come back? How many times did they come back? What was the cost of all those encounters versus the people that did not receive the intervention? So that shows a lot. You can get the information of the costs through the claims. You can get the information about the patients through the electronic health records or the EHR systems. So there's different types of data: the claims data, the admin data, and the registry data. There's a lot of excitement about data linkage or data tokenization. I feel like maybe that's too much for today's conversation, but there is a lot of ways and a lot of vendors out there that will help you link the information between the hospital systems to claim systems to registries, because those registries, especially when it comes to rare diseases, you might have a huge population that you could study. So if you don't have all that money, perhaps working just with advocacy groups would be a good start, especially when it comes to problem, kind of pressure testing what the problem you think is happening. So yeah.
Awesome. Very helpful. I hadn't thought of that, about the inclusion exclusion criteria of like a normal clinical trial. And in real world data, you're just not going to have that. We in previous lives where I worked at some clinical research organizations, we used to spend so much time talking to startups about, well, okay, we got to have some inclusion exclusion criteria, because the results need to be hopefully good, right? You don't want to have be treating the sickest population, and in real world data you don't get that, and that's both a positive and probably a negative. And I'm glad you highlighted the positives there. That's cool. Okay, so just for everyone, so they're aware of kind of where we're at in our questions. I have a couple more for Evelyn. So if you're waiting to drop questions in the chat, I would do it now, because once we kind of wrap up with our questions, we'll wrap up the webinar. So Evelyn, second to last question, kind of a two-parter. Are there certain types of pediatric devices, perhaps for rare diseases, or those focused on prevention, where building the economic case is especially tough? And then what creative strategies have you seen succeed in these difficult areas?
Well, no, there to my knowledge, there's probably more drugs out there for rare diseases than there are medical devices, but there are still medical devices for rare diseases when it comes to epilepsy, or I know from an orthopedic standpoint, there's a thoracic insufficiency syndrome, which is very rare, but there is a medical device on the market. It did take 15 years for it to get approved, because again, you have such a small patient population. So there wasn't enough clinical data available to show that this was effective. So it's again building up when it comes to when you have a rare disease, is trying to get enough patients to study, just so that you can show the benefit. And ultimately there are I'm kind of drifting over to drugs because I have a little bit more experience with some of these rare diseases. It comes down to you're not going to save money with these, but you might extend the time a child is out of a wheelchair by 6 months, and then you have the advocacy groups supporting the payers. It takes a lot of advocacy for some of these especially rare disease populations for these to be covered. So especially since as the children grow, if it were a device that's implanted, it probably needs to be replaced or adjusted on a regular basis. So those are going to incur more visits. For the thoracic insufficiency syndrome, there's it's a kind of expandable rib, because children have less volume within their thoracic cavity, so they can't breathe as well. So this rib will expand, and it is currently covered by a lot of payers, but now they're trying to use it for scoliosis. So as you see the evidence build for these rare diseases, you'll see more insurance and payers cover, but it is a slow process when it comes to rare diseases, unfortunately.
Yeah. I was just looking up an example of one, and it's a rare disease, but it's called esophageal atresia. It's EA is what it is. And essentially the esophagus does not connect to the stomach. And this was years ago. Cook Medical developed a device where they put a catheter in through the throat, through the mouth, and then another catheter in through a feeding tube that had magnets on the tips, and they inserted those, and then the magnets actually pulled them together. And because they're babies, it would actually fuse together, the esophagus and the stomach. And I think they showed, I was trying to look some of this up. The process usually took between 3 and 13 days. And the different approach to that was it was a minimally invasive surgery. Before that, it was major surgeries, multiple major surgeries. Yeah, faster connection. All 16 infants like had their esophagus joined in like record time compared to the other procedures. It was really, really cool. But as I'm reading more about this, I don't think the product's on the market anymore, and it's not because of safety or quality concerns. But potentially of some other things. But regardless, that was like just an interesting story of a device that treats a pretty rare disease. And I probably butchered the name of the disease, but describing it is what was important there. Okay, last question. What types of evidence strategies should innovators think of early on in their product life cycle? And this is kind of a tack on to 7 and probably your checklist. But in general, I think this is just a really good question to end with.
Yeah, presenting posters at conferences gives you something to refer back to. You have the benefit of, a peer review, even with a poster. And while it may not seem like the biggest deal, it's usually an attainable bit of research that you can pump out as you work on your product development. Don't underestimate the value of these just little bits of evidence being put out into the scientific body, evidence that supports that there is an issue, clearly define the clinical problem. If you have cost information, there's another source. Let me think about, I'll have to think about, shoot, I'm forgetting the name of it, but yeah, just clinical data available that as long as you're not using it for commercial use. A lot of people, we work with, are still within a college setting. So, there is available information about how much hospitals are paying for different diseases. H-cup data is something that someone could use to kind of, just put out an abstract to help kind of define their problem. Economic analysis or budget impact analysis can be rather time consuming and expensive. So that might be a little bit further down the line, but creating a targeted literature review, that's something that could be compelling to a healthcare administrator. Publishing, it doesn't have to be a tier 1 journal. It could be a tier 2 journal. Again, putting out as much evidence that has the chance to be peer reviewed as possible to develop not only the economics story, but what is the problem you're addressing? Because there might not be evidence of a problem. Sometimes you have a segment of the patient population that would actually benefit from your device. Maybe it's not all people with a certain problem. Maybe you have to create evidence that if you're between 7 and 13, this is the perfect time where people benefit. And these are very important pieces of evidence when it comes to building the overall economic story for your device. So again, if there's not a patient-reported outcome measure, that's another thing that you could, or if there is, that's research that you might have to do yourself to find out what is applicable to that therapeutic area. This all part of the market access strategy.
Great. Evelyn, we did get one more question. When talking about real-world evidence, how can we ensure we identify confounding factors to collect data on? Aware FDA has guidance, but sure, this would be quite specific to product and application.
Well, again, I would look at what the competitors are doing here. A lot of the evidence you'll be collecting, you're not necessarily the first person to market for this device. So if there's already been a clinical trial on clinicaltrial.gov, there is a great resource for you to go and look and see what other people are doing, what they've excluded from, like, that inclusion exclusion criteria that they're looking at. The exclusion criteria is super important when you're developing your studies too, because you don't want that, what they decide not to include might indeed be a compounder that you haven't thought of before. So you can search clinicaltrials.gov for studies that have SAPs available, which is, statistical analysis plans. And in there, you can find a lot more information of how they decided to really narrow down their population for their studies. So that certainly is a free resource to you that can help you with some of those without a specific example.
Cool. Awesome. Evelyn, this has been incredibly insightful. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and practical advice on such a crucial topic. The challenges are clear, but I think you also gave a lot of great pathways and resources to support innovation in the space. To our audience, thanks for the questions, the comments, the engagement. A reminder to visit pedsinnovation.org for more information on the MPDC, their services, and future events, including the in-person showcase in July in Cleveland. And please also subscribe to the YouTube channel, Peds Innovation, and follow MPDC on LinkedIn. This concludes our webinar. Thank you for joining us. And Evelyn, thank you so much for sharing some great knowledge.
Well, thanks for having me, Dwayne.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.